Welcome to the Oxa podcast, where we discuss science-based breathing tools and practices to optimize your health. Hi everyone, I'm your host, Matthew Chafford, biomedical engineer and health tech podcaster. Our guest today is Martin McPhilimey, who is a respiratory and sleep scientist, exercise physiologist, and behavioral science practitioner. With over 15 years of experience across the UK and Australia in research, clinical work, and training, he's not only an accredited coach and mentor, but also a passionate advocate for healthy, connected living. In this conversation, Martin touches on the physiology of motivation and the role of neurotransmitters like dopamine and noradrenaline driving the motivation response. He explains how breathing patterns can influence focus and arousal levels, how to modulate them, and the importance of striking the right balance between the two to reach peak performance. We talk about fast-paced breathing techniques and the Wim Hof method to boost motivation levels, as well as visualization techniques coupled with slow breathing techniques to enhance focus. By the end of this episode, you will know which breathing methods you can implement in your daily life to balance arousal and focus states and reach your goals sustainably. Before we jump right in, I'd like to add that this episode is brought to you by Oxa, the first breathing wearable with live biofeedback and your coach for enhanced sleep and stress relief. Oxa measures your vitals like your heart and respiratory rates and creates personalized exercises for you to control stress and get better sleep. Head over to oxalife.com, that's OXALIFE.com, for more details on how Oxa can help you live a healthier life. And now, here's our conversation with Martin McPhilimey. So what are the underlying physiological mechanisms of motivation, Martin?
I think first of all, it'd be good to define motivation, then go a little bit into the physiology behind it. So I would see the definition of motivation would be a feeling state that is driving you to pursue a goal. And I think if we look at the underlying physiology that is behind that, we have to look into a guy called Jaak Panksepp, a famous neuroscientist who discovered that we have what are called basic affective emotional systems, the primary emotional system being motivational to seek out goals in life. So we have homeostatic affects, which are to seek out food and safety and sleep and things like that. But then we have these emotional drives, and motivation is driven by what we'd call the mesolimbic mesocortical system. And it's dopamine that when is dripped into that or is increased in that, is then we have this feeling that we want to take motivation, want to drive towards a goal. If we break down the feeling into just a components a moment, we have what we'd call our arousal. So like a level of energy, like low arousal will be tiredness, high arousal will be excitement. And then we have like a valence to it. So a pleasurable feeling or an unpleasurable feeling. And motivation would be a high arousal state that would have a pleasurable feeling that allows us to move towards and pursue a goal.
So that's a bit like the physiology behind it. And how does that like relate to our ability to stay focused and concentrated? So you talked about dopamine. Is the goal like very schematically that we maintain those dopamine levels very high? I understand as well that we have like some cyclical, variations in energy levels. Can you share a bit about that?
Yeah, first of all, you'd want to decide what is that goal in general? What is the goal that you're trying to pursue? Now, if that is something external in life, we have to come up with that idea first to then start to manifest the ability to create dopamine in the pursuit of that. So that's going to be one thing that we'll have to be able to utilize. However, being able to stay focused on a goal is, there's a relationship between that and our level of arousal. So typically we'd see an inverted U-shaped theory in that if someone is bored because the goal is it's too easy, it's too simple, then there's going to be a low level of motivation, therefore a low level of focus. But if someone has a goal that is too overwhelming and too stressful, then the arousal level is too high. So then the person is not able to focus and they'll get distracted, maybe procrastinate and avoid. So there's a fine kind of tuning level of arousal that is for our peak performance. And that is what we'd call the ability to get into a flow state. And being in a flow state is when we have the right amount of level of arousal for the goal that we're trying to pursue.
Exactly. And so there, I would be interested to understand, and I guess this comes, there's a lot of different factors that play into it, but what is the connection or the level of connection between our motivational states and our breathing patterns or like the way we breathe? Is there any connection at all?
Yeah, sure. And it's really going to depend on, first of all, we could say breathing frequency in general. There's a direct, you could say a correlation, or maybe even now in some mice literature suggesting a causation between how fast someone breathes and how much noradrenaline is produced in the body, okay? Now, noradrenaline is obviously what increases our arousal and our stress state or our energy state. So there's almost like a fine balance between where our breathing frequency wants to be on a typical day-to-day basis that will either make us feel, that right amount of position on that arousal curve for performance. Now, guess what the precursor to noradrenaline is in terms of a chemical? It's dopamine. So also we know that those two chemical structures, they kind of lead into each other. So there's a link between breathing frequency and how fast one breathes and how much, therefore, noradrenaline is being secreted, and potentially also the ability to pursue a goal. So to actually pursue a goal, we need dopamine to drive us, to create motivation, but then we need noradrenaline to provide us with the arousal and energy to pursue that goal. And that is going to tie into our breathing frequency and therefore our breathing patterns as well. So typically if someone has a fast and shallow breathing pattern, that might then lead to excessive noradrenaline and to excessive levels, and therefore anxiety and the inability to focus. And we might therefore see someone having some attention deficit disorders. Yeah, but if that person was to be able to slow down their breathing frequency and fix their breathing patterns, we might then see that individual be more grounded and have a greater ability to stay focused on a task at hand and not flick from one to the other, and actually is able to stay grounded and pursue that goal through continual action.
I see. And it's interesting because we talk about motivation, we talk about the ability to focus. And at the beginning, when you said, well, if we want to increase dopamine levels or noradrenaline levels, which is a precursor, we have to increase the breathing rates or the breathing frequency. And I was about to say, this is almost like counterintuitive, because if you want to stay focused, or for example, when you see, I was thinking about like athletes in biathlon, when they have to hit the target, they have to actually reduce their breathing patterns. They have to like be ultra focused to reach the targets. And so it's not just the goal of saying, oh, I want to stay motivated longer term. I implement some kind of like breathing routine where I just like go a bit crazy, like a bit what Wim Hof does. It's a bit more subtle than that. It's like you have to stay in that, you pictured it nicely with this sort of curve where you want to stay in the higher end. And it depends on the type of task that you have to do in a way. So
yeah, learning motivation. You could even say breathing or breathing behavior, which is what we're talking about here. We're talking about how breathing becomes conditioned into actions and tasks. They are both context dependent and state dependent, meaning that we have to have it's no good a fighter coming in at a very kind of really relaxed, really kind of sluggish state. So they need to kind of find a state where that's going to be a higher level of arousal than the majority of other people in their context of what they're trying to achieve. But yet for them, they also need to be on the relaxed side of that. And they can't be too overwhelmed. We could say what Dan Siegel would say is a window of tolerance for their ability to tolerate that level of stress to be able to stay focused. But then for everyone else, the people who are typically anxious all the time, they might need to be able to focus and relax their breathing as a practice, or you could say is changing their function or their breathing behavior.
And so when clients come to you, do you also like identify a bit what type of, profile they are? If they are rather like, persons who naturally have those very high breathing frequency or rates, or the opposite? And then you basically see with them, okay, what type of practices we should aim for based on that? How do you assess that?
Yeah, so typically I'm going to be looking at things like their stress levels, their anxiety levels, their behaviors and patterns of their behaviors, what type of personality does that person have, assessing just through kind of the conversation, but also what their goal is of working with me to then work out the strategy of how I'm utilizing different breath practices and different practices to either do I need to bring down this person and ground them first, or actually this person's pretty grounded and therefore we can go into more task-related, goal-related visualization and start to use a different form of breath work to help assist and improve motivational dopamine or adrenaline in those situations. So I could kind of break that down of what that would look like if you wanted to, in terms of like a case of how that might look, which I think kind of leads into our next question anyway. So just for example, I've just finished working with a guy at the moment, and he just started a new job. Okay, moving a new job. So I said to him, well, let's start looking at your motivation for your job. He came to me with anxiety. His anxiety is now resolved. Now we're going to set some goals for him to go and pursue something, to be motivated to do it. So we go away, get him to reflect on how does he want to show up in his new role? What goals would he like to achieve in his new role? Okay, so then we have that. We have to then get him to visualize that. So that might just be through slow breathing, meditation. Visualize what's it look like. Then visualize yourself. What's it look like if you are to achieve those goals? Then actually get him to reflect on how it feels in the body at the time of him visualizing achieving those goals. So we're bringing interoceptive awareness into there, and sensation, which is affect. Then what you can do is you can drive up the respiratory rate and do a more of a power style breathing, a faster paced breathing, to anchor in a motivational state with the visualization. So then we're both taking in Jaak Panksepp's work of identifying a goal, pursuing the increased release of dopamine, and then attaching a breathwork pattern that can increase arousal and potentially anchor in that state to the individual.
And that would typically fit into like one sort of like session where you go through these different states, or it's more like this is the overall program and we try to fit like different, steps and different exercises along the way? Or does that fit into like a single session in a way?
So that there would be one session. So that would be a session that I might with towards the end of working with someone. Well, it depends what will they come with me for and the state they're currently in. I wouldn't want to give kind of hyperventilation, high ventilation style breath work to people who are quite anxious or panicky, for example. Yeah, if someone's quite calm, grounded, and then has the ability to kind of be in this state where they can kind of view a positive future, well, they can start to then use increase in breath rate to anchor in more positive states.
I see. And I was thinking, in terms of when we aim for like these very long-term goals where I guess it's, there is a certain rigor and consistency in implementing those methods. And that might also become a challenge because you're aiming for something in multiple years or a year from now. So rather like a long-term period. How do you help those, what tips would you have in terms of reaching that consistency or making sure that it's not something you do for like a week and then you still have this goal in mind, but you don't do that practice and then ultimately your motivation levels go down?
Yeah, if you think of what's mostly the biggest reason why people get a lack of motivation, it's usually because either the task is not challenging enough for them, so the goal's not enough for them to pursue it, or it's the fact that the goal is too big. We talked about that at the beginning. Yeah. Now, if the goal's too big, it's actually fear that then gets in the way. Yeah. So if we're thinking fear on an affect, it's still high arousal, but it's a negative sensation in our body. So when we feel something negative and unpleasant, it stops us from moving forward. So it's the opposite of what motivation does. Motivation feeling makes us move forward. So if we can get someone to image, a negative state and feel a negative state, but also to feel a positive state, if we can use that practice regularly to feel into that positive state, it's almost like we can create that positive state within them, which allows them to have more motivation long term. However, we also want to be making sure that we're doing things to reduce or habituate them to the sensation of a fear as well. So that might be coming to doing breath hold work, CO2 tolerance work, getting used to feeling that sensation that when we hold our breath and that fear starts to creep up, can we sit in that feeling and become habituated to it and realize that that is just an internal sensation and kind of attach a positive mindset to that negative sensation and change the conditioning to it. So then it reduces the impact that fear might potentially have on us long term.
Exactly. And so that works both ways, right? It's for like habituation or recognition of the fear state. So that's rather at the right hand side of the spectrum. And then on the left hand side where it's too easy, like when do you notice that you're actually dropping into, your motivation levels is dropping, you're getting bored and things are not working that way. So I guess that part needs to also be recognized and you need to assess that in a way.
Yeah. When it comes to that, it's about changing the goal, right? Or putting things in place to be able to increase the level of tension that someone's under. Time is usually a very positive thing that we can use there. If someone's bored, well, how about you do this task within the space of 24 hours? Now, all of a sudden, there's a level of pressure to put on someone. So that's not breathing related, but it might be a tool that I might particularly use.
And so if we dive into, you explain nicely like this session at the end of the sort of the journey you went through with one of your clients. So what specific breathing techniques do you use to, if we say like we want to increase those motivation levels, want to increase the noradrenaline levels, and we want to go for rather like high intensity breathing patterns, what specific techniques would you aim for?
Yeah, I mean, there's like, you could use shorter form Kapalbhati breath work. So it's just like nasal fast breath paced in. Okay. So just sharp, bringing up the intensity of the pace of breathing. We could use something like a Tumo breath, a Wim Hof breath, anything that's going to be quite fast and generally more inhalation focused in terms of the inhalation's a bit more forceful. Then I would probably be trying to use a practice like that. Typically, I would start on the more gentle side, and then as the person practices more and more, I'd get them to increase the intensity of the breath work itself, just so that they are building a kind of a tolerance to the actual increase in your dopamine and noradrenaline itself.
I see. And on the opposite, when you aim for, getting more into that visualization state and resting state, what other techniques would you recommend?
There, it might just be as simple as doing resonant frequency breathing, finding out what that coherence is. Now, I know that there are different variables of people can breathe between 3 and 7 breaths per minute and kind of have this state where they feel calm and relaxed, where HRV will kind of be increased. And that coherence frequency is quite a nice internally focused breath that can allow you to slow down, and then you start to bring some questions to mind. So those questions are, how do I want to show up? Who do I want to be? What goals do I want to achieve? What's the outcome that I want to expect? And that starts to bring the visualization up. You start to image it. When you image that, you start to feel it. And then we might switch over from the calm into the more activating style of breath work.
So if we were let's say we're just like a random person who thinks about, okay, well, I would like to implement those techniques, in my day, and being aware of, the framework we talked about before. Is this something we need to do once a day? Is it something you need to do multiple times a day? How do we practically implement this into our daily life? Is it something we need to do, on a daily basis? Is this something you need to do once a week? Do you have any tips there?
Yeah, I think it really depends. I think if there's a new shift in someone's life, then it's a good time on a macro space to look at, you're creating changes like a new job, or maybe your first time at work, or your first time in a competition. That's a great time to bring visualization in, so you can start to mentally rehearse that. Or if you just want to do it more on a micro scale, 5 to 10 minutes each morning. First thing upon the morning, how do you want your day to go today? What do you want your day to look like today? If you've got any small goals or small tasks that you want to achieve, 2 to 3 goals that you want to achieve throughout the day, can you just sit in the state of visualizing the outcome of that actually working, and what's it feel like, and then anchor that in using a calm and then an activating breath.
Can you share any either research or anecdotes from your clients that demonstrated the effectiveness of, improving motivation through breath work over long-term, let's say, or rather long-term duration? Anything quite...
Can I give you a prime example of through myself? Yeah. Literally just yesterday. Yeah, I had my first Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu competition yesterday. And obviously you can imagine the amount of stress that comes within the 48 hours towards the first time ever competing in a fight. And number one, the level of adrenaline that comes through your body. First of all, you got to use something like a coherent breath or a down regulation breath to reduce that adrenaline throughout the day. But also, I wanted to start to utilize the outcome as me seeing myself walk onto the mat, shake hands with the ref, fist bump with the opposition, and then start to wrestle and fight, and then have your hand raised, and to image all the movement patterns that you want to go through, rehearsing those in your mind whilst I'm doing my slow breathing, but then bring that in as a visualization process of activating my breath as well. And then the outcome of that was, when I was on the actual mat itself, it was almost like I'd already been on the mat, and there was no adrenaline. Obviously, there was a certain extent, but I wasn't overwhelmed with it. So this is, I guess, the nuances of just being able to use things like visualization and kind of getting into those states that can help us mentally rehearse potential outcomes or potential times where things are going to be challenging. And it allows us to almost be there before it actually happens. So you get some form of training or exposure to it. You
ended up winning.
I got 2 draws and 1 loss. I didn't end up winning, but it was a submissions only competition. And so 2 draws is almost good enough for me at the moment. First time.
Congrats. Yeah, we've covered quite some ground. I think there is, if we move away from just motivation building, is there one breathing practice that you would recommend everyone to adopt? That's kind of one of the closing questions we were asking in each episode. Is there anything you do on a daily basis where you're I'm never going away from that?
Yeah, I think if I was to generalize one breathing practice to a typical audience, would be a form of just focusing on having good breathing mechanics. So breathing nasally, breathing gently, breathing slow, and again, kind of this lateral expansion in your lower rib cage. Practicing that for 10 to 15 minutes before bed every single day. That is probably it's the first thing I give to every single one of my clients, because most people are going to get a significant improvement in their quality of sleep because they're going to down-regulate and therefore wake up feeling more alert and more energized. But if they're focusing on that good breathing mechanics, it's going to shift their breathing behavior long-term mechanically anyway. So that's where anyone can start, and there's no downfalls to being able to put that into practice. Now, to make it more implementable, start 5 minutes. Most people, when they try to achieve a goal, and they have motivation to do a goal is they set the goal like, okay, well, if you haven't got a breath practice, I'm going to try and practice 20 minutes a day for 7 days a week. And they try and sit down and can't sit down for 5 minutes. Well, then all of a sudden the goal's so big, they just don't do it at all. Yeah. So if they break that down to a smaller step, well, can I achieve 5 minutes for 5 days this week? Then they hit that goal. Well, what does that do? It releases the dopamine, so they're setting the next goal. Okay, well, can we do 8 minutes 5 days a week? Can we do 10 minutes 6 days a week? Can we do 12 minutes 6 days a week? Can we do 15 minutes 7 days a week? And then 15 minutes 20 days a week? 20 minutes 7 days a week, sorry. We've just gradually tailored that ability to achieve something over a period of time, and we've built their ability to sit in stillness and calm, and therefore build a long-term breath practice.
You mentioned the research from one scientist. I forgot the name, but we'll make sure we add the name in the show notes. Do you have other resources that you would encourage our audience to consult regarding motivation building through breathwork or visualization through breathwork? Anything you'd like to recommend, a book, a paper, whatever?
I've read so many papers and I can never really remember the names of all the authors. And I don't really read that too many books because I'm always in the literature. So no authors come into mind and no particular papers come into mind. It's only Jaak Panksepp's work that I kind of look into in terms of the motivation. Yeah, unfortunately, nothing comes to my mind there.
And maybe another question that I just had, like, when your clients, they come to you, they go through the journey, they go back with some kind of practice and a clear idea of what their goals are, what they can use in terms of breathing practices, visualization to reach it. Do they see do they reach those goals? Like, do you see an upward trend in terms of success rates, or do they come back to you and say, hey, at that race or at that promotion, and you clearly see that there's like a positive result to it? I would assume yes, but is this like a consistent thing you see?
The key thing is still taking the action. So we can feel we have a motivation, we can feel we can have the goal, but it's actually taking the action that requires obviously the success, right? That's the element that majority of us who generate some form of practice are trying to help us to do, but still need to take that action. Having a coach or having someone guide you to do things and having accountability allows you to then show up and actually take the action because you've got that extrinsic kind of motivator to support you along the way. And often people don't want to kind of like upset their coach or not pursue their goals when someone else is watching them. So that does help for sure. And then it's about keeping up the practice afterwards and sustaining that practice long term. That then allows people to obviously have a higher chance of a success rate. That's going to depend on whether people fall off in the practice when they have the coach, when they leave the coach and they don't continue to work with the coach, or whether they can actually continue to pursue it. Now, I would say the factor here is actually whether individuals are pursuing what I'd say is an extrinsic goal or an intrinsic goal. Most people, if they have a larger intrinsic goal, meaning like it gives them, I guess, more feeling of internal satisfaction and purpose, they're more likely to sustain that long term because they're not outsourcing their motivation to something else, which can always change. You can always lose a job, you can always lose a partner, you can always break up with a coach. But if you have a real anchored purpose or meaningful goal inside, you can always kind of sustain that and tap back into that breath practice, back into that visualization, back into the feeling of what is it that you're motivated by internally, and that's where the practice can help sustain it long term.
And do you help them to transition from like that external source of motivation to intrinsic, or like internal? Like, is this something you help them with?
So typically that's something that I would tend to help people towards the end of working with people with stress and anxiety, is to start setting goals with them. We know that when there is a goal in pursuit, the drive or motivation towards that actually helps remove negative emotions such as fear. So we were building courage by reaching goals. So that then reduces more anxiety and more negative sensations in their body because they're actually achieving and growing in courage, growing in confidence. That the end result of continual action through motivation is confidence, which is the reduction of level of anxiety.
Exactly, and the knowledge that you are, moving forward and getting closer to those goals that you set yourself. And in terms of like follow up to the clients you have, like I guess it all fits in a rather like long-term relationship. Like, how long do you accompany people? Is it like multiple years? Is it like just a few months? I guess it depends also on the individual needs.
It depends on the individual's needs. It depends on their goals of what they want to achieve with working with me. But typically, I'm not going to work with anyone less than 2 months to reduce things like stress and anxiety. And it might be 3 to 6 months to really help them to set out a pathway of like, what does the future look like for you for the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. them to have that in place. Then that might go from them working with me weekly to then just checking in monthly or bi-monthly or even just once a year, depending on how much support they want.
Yeah, makes sense. And you're able to do this like remotely or in person? I guess in person is probably better, but
I mean, in person's better, but I built all my business whilst I was traveling the world. So all my business works online. And it's just as easy to work with people online because it allows for a larger scope, a larger practice, and to meet new people and for people to find me easily as well.
Perfect.
There's no bounds to location.
Awesome. No, thanks so much, Martin, for your time and for, taking us through this. I think it was very well explained. We started with this curve. We know how you can, how we position ourselves like within the curve, how we increase the motivation states by, increasing the breathing rates through techniques like Wim Hof, others that we mentioned, and also like foster like visualization of those goals and, kind of like imagining yourself in the situation while being into a more like a resting state. So I think it was like super compelling, super well explained. Is there anything else you want to add to our audience regarding the motivation building or anything else?
I think a real key point here is having self-awareness of where you currently fit in that inverted U curve, like knowing what does being hyper-aroused feel like, having too much arousal, and what does having a lack of arousal actually feel like in terms of a lack of motivation. Being able to be aware of that consistently and knowing where you're at kind of day to day or week by week allows us then to go, what sort of practice do I need to be doing more of right now? If I'm more so hypo-aroused and that's not low arousal, then lacking motivation, and that's not because of sleep issues or behavioral issues, then an upregulation practice might be able to increase that and help you feel more motivated. But if you're typically feeling really anxious and you're in that anxiety state and you have the awareness of that, then we probably wouldn't want to be practicing more of that upregulation breathing. We'd want to do downregulation practice to bring us more onto the left-hand side of the curve or bring us back into the center of that curve. We want to use the breath practice to shift the level of arousal, but also to increase the awareness of our state in general. And that's probably one of the key things that breathwork does, is actually just improve self-awareness.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Martin.
No worries. Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for listening to our conversation with Martin McPhilimey, where we discuss breathing tools to build sustained motivation and enhance focus. To learn more about and explore the resources that Martin mentioned, check out the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode of the Oxa podcast, subscribe on YouTube or your preferred streaming platform and give us feedback via email using podcast@oxalive.com or in the comment section. Feel free to also share topic suggestions for the next episodes, as well as guest recommendations. If you know someone who would benefit from today's conversation, please share the episode with this person. As an additional way to support the show, you can leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It helps us a lot bringing the show forward. Thanks again for listening to today's conversation and for your interest in the science of breathing.